And I want to welcome everybody into the Fifth Dimension podcast, where we are attempting to live more mindfully in the day to day, quite simply make this world a little bit of a better place. I'm your host, Evan McDermott, and we're going to be talking about a very important subject for what's going on in the world right now. The solutions we're going to be looking for, I don't believe they're going to come from social movements, but they're going to come from psychological movements. And I'm going to jump into this in just a minute. But first, if you are a fan of the show, please give us a subscription. Maybe if you're watching on YouTube, you can like, subscribe, comment. If you're Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating. This social feedback is how more people find the show. And ultimately, we're trying to create a better humanity where we can all come together as one. And, we need listeners to do that. So I appreciate all the people who do listen regularly and, give the feedback on the show. If you're interested in more content, do check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Evan McDermott. You'll find exclusive guided meditations, some exclusive podcast content, a great Fifth Dimension community once it builds up a little bit. We'll admit there's, as I checked this morning, 0 Patreons. It is new, so if you be the first Patreon subscriber, you will get a special gift. We'll say that to the first subscriber. So, do check those out, and you can always find us on social media if you want to interact at Instagram, the Fifth Dimension Podcast, and at Evan McDermott as well. So let's jump into this podcast, this solo cast, and I do think it's a really important topic if we are going to create a society of love, peace, compassion. And, to create these things, it takes a great amount of individual responsibility. There's a great deal of work that one has to do in terms of looking at our own conditioning, looking at our flaws, and owning these flaws, seeing what they they are, and how we can use them to sort of improve ourselves and ultimately contribute to the collective. Because if we can control our own ideologies, we can control our own beliefs, we can understand different viewpoints. We can be tolerant to others with different viewpoints than our own. And that is the quality of an effective leader. That's the qualities of people who can make change in this world. A lot of times with these social movements, people make social movements a large part of their identity. And I'm going to give specific examples of this later. But when you do this, we see social movements be fueled with hatred. And, people allow social movements to give them an identity, when in reality it should be individuals collectively shaping the social movement. And I don't think we see that taking place very often. But what is sort of the consequence of not doing this in our work? Sort of what I'm just talking about. Jordan Peterson has a great quote of, people not capable having their own house in order should be very careful on how they try to reorganize the world. And he's actually taken a lot of flack for that comment, which I think is ridiculous. He's talking about individual personal responsibility. People sort of adopt these pseudo-moralistic stances and ideologies to merely, they want to look good. They want to appear as this virtuous person to their friends, to their family, to their neighbors, community. I think this runs rampant in the days of social media. We can post a black square on Instagram and all of a sudden you care about Black Lives Matter and you're ending racism. When in reality, it's these pseudo-moralistic activist, activities don't always lead to change because we are not taking personal responsibility of how we are complicit in specific areas. There's a great proverb that's attributed to a monk in, I believe it's around the 12th, 13th century. And I'm going to read it to you guys real quick because I think it's very telling of what we are experiencing right now. When I was a young man, I wanted to change the world. I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my nation. When I found I couldn't change my nation, I began to focus on my town. I couldn't change my town, And as an older man, I tried to change my family. Now, as an old man, I realize the only thing I can change is myself. I could have made an impact on my family. My family and I could have made an impact on my town. My town's impact could have changed the nation. And I, indeed, could have changed the world. So, what I think the message of this proverb is very clear. There is a great deal of individual responsibility that comes with trying to change the world. We have to change ourselves. And changing ourselves, the avoidance of changing ourselves is ultimately, it's what prevents us from doing the inner work. We certainly aren't taught to look inward. I will say it's not easy to do. There is a lot of, it's a scary unknown, you could say, when we start looking at our own conditioning, when we start looking at the things that make us who we are. But, I do ask you, what are you avoiding? As I'm saying, this individual thinking needs to shape the collective. We can't allow a collective group shape your individual identity. Certainly, there are positive elements to group thinking in ways and the sharing of ideas and coming together. But you need to take individual control of your responsibility so you can contribute to the betterment of ideologies. It's a hard question to ask. What are you avoiding? But I myself have realized I avoided things my whole life. Avoiding was, an abandonment was sort of a coping mechanism for the insecurities that I had within myself. And, we're not perfect. Nobody is perfect. If we were perfect, we would be living in a utopia. We wouldn't be in the mess that we are in the first place. But we need to embark on our own hero's journey, if you will, of looking at our conditioning. And we need to do it now, or we are not going to solve the issues that are at stake. You really think a piece of legislation is going to solve racism? No. It's going to solve through the exchange of ideas, through community, through connection with one another, and embracing all viewpoints and learning past our conditioning. So, we need to work on our ego, because they really do trick us into thinking that our worldview is the only correct one. Our ego doesn't take into account other people's experiences, and when we don't work on ourselves, we go into the world. This is particularly what a lot of social movements do, and a lot of the division is caused from this. We go into the world trying to instill this perfect worldview on why we think, what we think we have, and, we sort of reject anything that may challenge our thinking, and this is rampant in our society today. You see cancel culture. You see the great division. Why do you think we're on the brink of practical civil war and people wanting to kill one another just for different ideologies? We refuse to hear other people's opinions. And the fact that you even tell this to somebody, they're going to call you a piece of shit, or, a racist, or it's ridiculous. We need to open ourselves up to hear all sides of the argument, because that's the only way that anything is going to get done. If you tell somebody they're a piece of shit and a racist, they're just going to say, okay, well, I'm not going to talk with you then, and I'm just going to double down on my own ideology. It takes wisdom and humility and maturity to actually admit when you may be wrong with your own conditioning and ideologies. And it takes wisdom, humility, and maturity to be able to listen and try and understand why people think the way they do. Perfect example is President Donald Trump, right? I understand why Donald Trump got elected. A lot of the rural white Americans felt left behind by the Democratic left, and that's understandable. I understand where they're coming from. I am not a fan of Donald Trump, but I see why they voted for him. And I think a lot of people on the left are going to be in for a shock come November, because it's the same strategy that is taking place in terms of trying to elect Joe Biden. So, we avoid sort of the root of these issues, and we avoid the root of what is dividing us, and it only creates further division. And we sort of take on, almost without looking at our own individual responsibilities and looking at sort of what these ideas are actually causing in the collective. There's almost there's this virtue signaling, and it's something that is so prevalent in our society because of a lack of individual responsibility. So I was saying, virtue signaling is something that is done at the individual level, certainly individuals who are doing it, but yet it's also fueled by this lack of responsibility at the corporate and political level as well. And I'm going to give examples of each. I guess just the first, before I jump into them, virtue signaling, for anybody who does not know, it means sort of, wanting to appear as this virtuous, moral person, as opposed to taking actions to be a virtuous, moral person. Now, I have nothing wrong with, there's nothing wrong with online activism and social media activism and being an advocate. But if you're only doing it to simply appear in a certain way, that means you're virtue signaling. And, let's look at how we see it on the personal level. In particular, Black Lives Matter. Now, I will say I support Black Lives Matter, but I think there's a lot of virtue signaling and sort of collective identities shaping individual identity, and we need to have that switch. That can't be what is going to fuel a movement. Now, the question is, why are you complicit in a lot of societal norms regarding racism? There's so many things that, let's look at it. We post all these black squares on Instagram, right? My black square is going to end racism. But why do so many of us continue to feed in to the complicit racism that is just blatant in our society? What about redlining our school districts in almost every big city, and de facto segregation, where you move into specific neighborhoods of, look at Boston. Perfect example. I've lived there for 5 years. I don't live there right now. Boston is segregated. The schools are segregated because you have your quote unquote black neighborhoods and your quote unquote white neighborhoods. What happens? What about the housing market? Why is it that when a black family moves into a predominantly white neighborhood, all the property values go down? Why are we complicit in these things, and we can allow them to continue to happen? We don't see people taking individual responsibility for moving their kids into a white school system or a white neighborhood and sort of play into this de facto segregation and refuse to speak up about it. Why don't we see that happening? There's so many things going on at this beyond just what we even realize on the surface. What's on the surface, what's on the mainstream news, and what's circulating on social media, and the defund the police movement, which I understand the defund the police movement. I think we should have less of a police militarized state and invest in a lot of these educational programs. But why do we avoid so many of the huge talking points? You can't solve a complex problem like racism by simply joining a social movement and hoping a magical piece of legislation is going to fix everything. No, it takes a great deal of individual responsibility to see where you are complicit in your actions. And I think we're all complicit in our actions in ways in terms of the division of people. And I think a lot of it has to do with social class as well. Social class is a huge issue in this country when we choose to live in hierarchies, and you can't even say capitalism is the only reason that there is inequality. It certainly doesn't help inequality, but inequality is the great question of mankind. Inequality has been around since the dawns of civilization. So again, you can't, there is no simple solution. It's not just eliminate capitalism, because what comes after that? Well, that doesn't necessarily solve the inequality question, because inequality was around before capitalism. We need to broaden our views, and we need to expand our views and look into these questions individually, and not just fall for simple collective ideologies that don't scratch the surface of what the root of the problem may be. And that problem is we don't see ourselves in one another. We all need to wake up to the fact that we are all one. We are, everybody is your brother and your sister. And that lack of seeing ourselves in one another is what causes so much division, so much separation. If there's no change to how you sort of interact with the hierarchical system of society, you're complicit. If you're not trying to change yourself and see how you interact, you're complicit. And, we compete against one another. We don't see ourselves as, one another. If you aren't looking within to your own conditioning and your own upbringing and how you live your life, and you aren't willing to sacrifice, you're not going to make a difference. And in fact, you're probably going to do more harm than good, especially if you're trying to impose certain viewpoints without listening to others. We all need to cultivate our listening skills. You have to actually be the change you want to see in the world. And it sounds cliche, but it's true. It's said for a reason. Another perfect example of sort of individual ideologies is climate change. And I support the climate change movement. I understand that the climate is changing. I question what can actually be done about it. I do believe we need to stop polluting our planet. We should lower our carbon emissions. I think there is a lot of human-caused climate change. But then again, also, you start digging deep into the science. 90% of Earth's life didn't have ice caps. So can we actually save them? I don't know. Maybe we're moving out of the phase of ice caps, and we're technically, anytime Earth has ice caps, it's technically an ice age. So are they even savable is a question that I don't even know if we can answer. But I think what we can do is work to individually change how we interact with the Earth. What sacrifices are you making to go against the destruction of the planet? What sacrifices are you actually making individually? You can post about it all you want on social media, but are you continuing to mindlessly consume and sort of, purchase from Amazon and these large corporations who view Earth as this finite resource that is meant to be commodified, and that is their purpose of Earth? This is a perfect example of a pseudo-moralistic stance where you want to support the Earth, but you're not willing to give up the luxury of Amazon, and you're not willing to give up the luxury of the Walmarts and all these products that completely destroy ecosystems and contribute to species loss, because it creates luxury within your own life, a perceived luxury of convenient 2-day shipping. So it's a perfect example of virtue signaling, in the sense that supporting climate change but not changing our own individual actions. Yeah, it's great to recycle, but that's almost a standard now. You have to go above and beyond and understand what your impact actually is. I think if people realized their own individual impact, they would be shocked if you were able to sort of look at it from a bird's eye view. So if you actually want to change the world, you should change yourself. And corporations engage in virtue signaling all the time as well, actually. And particularly it comes with taking stances on social justice issues. I think we see that all the time. Like, sure, it's great, Coca-Cola, that you're an ally for the LGBTQ community, but what are you actually doing? Or Amazon in particular, again, they're the ones sort of fueling mindless consumption. They're the ones fueling, we talk about Coca-Cola, they're the ones fueling health problems. They're fueling the destruction of the planet. They're the ones that are taking advantage of our mindless consumption. So really, any sort of stance they take, it's not for it's simply to continue the system that they have set up to get us continually mindlessly consuming their products and make us have a positive view of their products. If Coca-Cola stands for LGBTQ rights, when you go to the store and you see a bottle of Coca-Cola, you're going to think about that and be like, oh, I want to drink Coca-Cola because they're an ally. And it's really a game they play, I suppose. So, and the same thing with politicians. You know, the perfect example of this, absolute perfect example of this, and I rolled my eyes like out of the back of my head when I saw this, was, Pelosi and some of the other Democratic leaders. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, in case you could not tell. Some of the Democratic leaders, they kneeled for 9 minutes while wearing this African kente cloth, which was extreme cultural appropriation, by the way. And what a stunt! What are you doing? Why? Why are you doing this? You don't care. You're the ones who created this problem in the first place. Demand policy, not this, like, just stunt to try and, I'm an ally of George Floyd. Like, what are you doing? You don't care about Black Lives Matter when you're the ones who created the problem of mass incarceration and continuing to segregate our schools and continue to fuel racism by... They're a perfect microcosm of how individuals don't listen to one another, because political leaders don't listen to one another either. They don't have a spreading of ideas. They try and impose these grand ideas from social movements onto one another while refusing to understand how people actually think and live in this country. Completely out of touch. Demand policy, not these social political stunts. The system they created is what is causing the problems now anyways. It's why people are in the streets protesting, burning buildings, because they're fed up. And if you hadn't seen that picture, them all wearing the quilt, which they got some flack for, deservedly so, go look that up, because it'll make you roll your eyes out the back of your head. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, it doesn't matter who is in power unless there's going to be deep structural change. Biden and Trump are two sides of the same coin, not to get too political here. This change, this deep structural change that I'm talking about, it's circling back to the individual. It has to start at the individual level. You have to take individual responsibility for your life, for your actions, for the social movements you engage in. Individual ideas need to be shaping social movements, okay? Change yourself and you can change the world, like that Buddhist proverb said. And, that means listening to opposing viewpoints. That means understanding why people think the way they do. You're not going to end racism through a magical piece of legislation when the system itself is fueled by inequality and fueled by racism and fueled by a hierarchical class system. Okay? You have to end racism by listening to one another, by coming together as people, by demanding change as people, as one. You need to get everybody on your side. I truly believe if everybody were to sit down, and it's unrealistic in a way because there are 350 million people, but if we all, every single one of us, put in the work to try and understand one another, we would end racism. We would see where the heart of the matter lies. And the only way we can do this is by you looking within yourself and you trying to understand other people as well, and not letting, social movements shape your individual identity, but you shape the social movement. Okay? And maybe there are things that, you disagree with in social movements that you don't want to speak out against. Always speak your truth without the fear of consequence. That's why I'm doing this podcast right now. I expect to get some flack for this because, a perfect example is sort of I saw some videos of people. It felt like a cult practice where someone is reading these ideas and out loud, and people are all like bent on the knee and reading it back. So it almost felt like a brainwashing technique. Like, we don't need that. We need individuals who are feeling empowered and can research and can have conversations, as opposed to mindlessly following a particular ideology. I don't care what the ideology is. We're all intelligent and capable, regardless of what you may think. We're all intelligent and capable of formulating opinions and ideas, and anyone with a moral standpoint is going to see where racism is, and see that once they start looking into their conditioning, you can see where you fall short. You have to be willing to be critical of yourself. Otherwise, you're never going to solve the problems in the world. It's just a fact. So, the hierarchies exist, are far larger than just a simple, the hierarchies and the problems that exist are a far bigger problem than just the political structure, putting in a piece of legislation and trying to fix everything. We need some deep change. The range of solution of what we're going to accomplish, of what we need to accomplish, the conversations we need to be having, it's too limited with a sociological perspective when you're following a group identity, because it's limited opinions, it's limited ideas. You need to take an individual psychological perspective, come up with your own ideas, and have the conversations that will drive the narrative. That is the most important thing you could be doing right now. That is the most important thing you could be encouraging others to be doing right now. Don't hate on somebody maybe because they aren't so active in their social media activism. Maybe they're doing the inner work. Maybe they're having tough conversations with people, trying to understand different viewpoints and different narratives. Because that's what we need. We need that just as much as we need people, protesting out in the open. Don't let the conversation stop, but be open to all viewpoints. Cancel culture is a horrible thing because you're eliminating opposing viewpoints and you're not trying to understand other sides. So, with that, I suppose that'll wrap up this solo cast, this monologue. Do be open to different ideas. Work on yourself individually, and that will fuel a collective change, one where we can create a society more based on compassion, peace, love, humanitarianism, you name it, all that good stuff. So if you enjoy this podcast, as I said in the beginning, like, subscribe, comment, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts with some feedback. It's greatly appreciated. And I appreciate all the support on here. Go check us out on Instagram at the Fifth Dimension Podcast or at F. McDermott. And, with that, I shall leave you. Enjoy the rest of your day, week, and don't put off that inner work. The world needs you. I'll see you later.